Here are the most brutal punishments in human history. Not quick executions. Not merciful deaths. These are methods designed to maximize suffering, to break the body and mind, and to serve as public warnings. These are the punishments that remind us just how cruel humans can be to each other. Let us start with methods that were relatively common and work our way to the truly nightmarish. Crucifixion. This was used by the Romans for hundreds of years, mostly on slaves, foreigners, and anyone who went against the state. The brutal part of crucifixion is that the victim's own body killed them. The victim was usually beaten and whipped first, then forced to carry the wooden crossbeam to the execution site. Their arms were stretched out and nailed to the beam through the wrists. The nails would often hit a major nerve, causing constant burning pain down the arms. The feet were nailed to the bottom of an upright post. Once the cross was raised, the victim's body would hang in a way that made it almost impossible to breathe. The only way to take a breath was to push up on the nails in their feet. As the hours went on, the muscles would give out and pushing up became harder and harder. Eventually, the victim could not push up at all and they slowly suffocated. Death could take anywhere from a few hours to several days. If the executioners wanted to speed things up, they would break the victim's legs. The body was usually left on the cross afterward for birds and animals. After the slave revolt led by Spartacus was crushed in 71 BCE, around 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome. A 120-kilometer stretch of road lined with crosses. When a Roman slave owner named Pedanius Secundus was killed by one of his slaves, all 400 of his slaves were crucified, including women and children, regardless of whether they were involved. It was a message. This is what happens when you disobey. In 1968, a heel bone with a crucifixion nail still in it was found in a tomb in Jerusalem. Physical proof of how this method actually worked. Crucifixion was banned in the 4th century after Rome converted to Christianity. Rat torture. From the medieval period all the way into the 1970s, rats were used to torture prisoners across Europe and South America, mostly to get information out of them. The most common version involved placing a rat on the victim's bare stomach and covering it with a metal bowl or bucket. The bowl was then heated from the outside with a torch or hot coals. As the metal got hotter, the rat would panic and try to escape. The only way out was down. So it would start clawing and chewing through the victim's flesh, digging into the stomach to get away from the heat. Once inside the body, the rat kept going, tearing through whatever was in its way until it found a way out. The victim was awake for all of it, feeling every movement, every bite, every tear. A Dutch military leader named Diederik Sonoy was known for using this on prisoners during the 80 Years' War in the 16th century. In medieval Germany, there was a version where a metal cage full of starving rats was locked around the victim's head. The rats would eat the victim's face while they were still alive. In the Tower of London there was a cell called the Rat Dungeon. When the River Thames rose, the water would push hundreds of rats into the cell where prisoners were chained up. The rats would chew on them for days. The worst version showed up during Argentina's Dirty War from 1976 to 1983. Political prisoners were subjected to this method by military interrogators. Thousands of people were tortured. Many disappeared. And rat torture was among the methods used to extract confessions or simply to break people completely. The Judas Cradle. This medieval torture device was used across Europe, particularly during the Spanish Inquisition. It was a pyramid-shaped wooden or metal seat mounted on a stand. The victim was suspended above it by ropes, then slowly lowered onto the point. The point would penetrate the body through the anus, vagina, or other sensitive areas. The victim was not impaled quickly. They were lowered slowly. Over hours. Sometimes days. The torturer could control the speed. Add weights to the victim's legs to increase pressure. Or raise and lower them repeatedly to prolong the suffering. The device was rarely cleaned, so infections were common. Even if the victims survived the torture, they often died from septic shock days later. The Judas Cradle was used to extract confessions. And it was effective. Because after hours of this, people would confess to anything, whether they were guilty or not. Flaying. Flaying, or skinning someone alive, has been used as a punishment across multiple cultures and time periods. The Assyrians were particularly known for it. They would flay prisoners of war and display the skins on city walls as warnings. The process was slow. The skin was peeled away in strips while the victim was still conscious. Death came from shock, blood loss, or infection. But not quickly. In medieval Europe, flaying was sometimes used as a punishment for treason or heresy. In some cases the skin was preserved and displayed. There are historical accounts of human skin being used to bind books or create drumheads. a reminder of what happened to those who defied authority. One of the most famous cases was the Flaying of Valerian, a Roman emperor captured by the Persians in 260 CE. According to legend, after he was flayed alive, his skin was stuffed and put on display in a Persian temple as a trophy. Scaphism, the boats. We covered this in a previous video, but it deserves mention again because it is genuinely one of the most horrific punishments ever devised. Used in ancient Persia, the condemned person was trapped between two boats or hollowed-out tree trunks with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. They were force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. Honey was smeared on their face and exposed skin to attract insects. The boats were placed on a stagnant pond in the sun. Flies, wasps, and other insects would swarm. The victim could not move, could not escape. They were continuously fed to keep them alive as long as possible. The waste attracted more insects, which laid eggs, which became maggots, which began to consume the person's flesh while they were still alive. This could last for weeks. The longest recorded case was a Persian soldier named Mithridates who allegedly survived 17 days before finally dying. Whether this method was common or rare is debated by historians. But the detailed accounts exist, and they are terrifying. Sawing. This method was used in medieval Europe and parts of Asia. The victim was hung upside down and a large saw was used to cut them in half vertically, starting from the groin. Being upside down ensured that blood flowed to the brain, keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The sawing would continue down through the torso. Some accounts say victims remained conscious until the saw reached the chest or abdomen. This punishment was typically reserved for severe crimes like adultery, murder, or witchcraft. It was public. It was meant to terrify. And it worked. Brazen Bull. We have covered this before, but it is worth repeating. The Brazen Bull was a hollow bronze statue of a bull with a door on the side. The condemned person was locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath. As the metal heated, the person inside was slowly roasted alive. The bull was designed with acoustic tubes that transformed the screams into sounds resembling a bull's roar. To the crowd outside it sounded like an animal, not a human being burned alive. The inventor, Paralaus, was the first victim. He presented it to the tyrant Phalaris, who immediately had him locked inside to test it. Phalaris himself was later executed in the same device when he was overthrown. What goes around comes around. Blood Eagle. This is one of the most debated execution methods in history because we are not entirely sure if it was actually practiced or if it was just a terrifying legend. According to Norse sagas, the Blood Eagle was a ritual execution used by Vikings on their worst enemies. The victim was placed face down. The ribs were cut away from the spine with an axe or sword. The lungs were then pulled out through the opening and spread across the victim's back like wings. Some accounts say salt was rubbed into the wounds. The victim was allegedly kept alive through the process, though modern medical experts doubt this was possible. Whether it actually happened or not, the Blood Eagle was described in enough sagas that it became a symbol of Viking brutality. And the fact that people believed it happened was enough to terrify their enemies. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is another device whose historical use is debated. It was supposedly a large iron cabinet shaped like a person with spikes on the inside. The victim was placed inside and the door was slowly closed. The spikes would pierce the body in non-fatal areas first. Limbs. Torso. The victim would bleed out slowly over hours or even days. Most historians believe the Iron Maiden was a later invention, possibly created in the 18th or 19th century for museums and torture exhibitions. But even if it was not widely used, the concept alone is horrifying. And there are enough references to spiked enclosures in medieval texts that something similar may have existed. The rack. The rack was one of the most common torture devices in medieval Europe, particularly in England. It was a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to the rollers. The rollers were then turned, stretching the body. As the tension increased, joints would dislocate. First the shoulders, then the hips, then the knees, then the elbows. Tendons would tear. Ligaments would snap. And if the torture continued, limbs could be pulled completely off. The rack was used primarily to extract confessions. And it worked, because the pain was unbearable. People would confess to anything, whether they were guilty or not. The rack was used during the Spanish Inquisition in the Tower of London and across Europe for centuries. The lesson. These punishments were not just about death. They were about control, about fear, about making sure that anyone who thought about disobeying, rebelling, or questioning authority knew exactly what would happen to them. They were public. They were slow. And they were designed to break not just the body but the spirit. And the worst part? Most of these methods were legal, sanctioned by governments, carried out in public squares, with crowds watching. Because for most of human history, cruelty was not just accepted. It was celebrated. It was justice. So the next time you think the modern world is harsh, remember this. At least we are not flaying people alive anymore. At least we are not feeding them to rats. At least we are not sawing people in half while they are still conscious. Progress is slow, but it is real. And these punishments are a reminder of how far we have come, and how important it is that we never go back.